All right, we're here to talk about pleasure, pain, and moral engineering. This is our class on ethical well-being, and we've already been talking about pleasure because we've been discussing hedonism, and we've kind of been talking about pain. So we'll learn what moral engineering is. All right, so we'll start with pleasure. It's a good place to start. And Thomas Hurka, he is having a conversation with somebody. It's actually part of a podcast called Philosophy Bites. And there's an important conceptual distinction that we need to know about to really understand what he's talking about here. And it's going to give us some more insight into hedonism also. But it's not going to be easy. Not at all. So we're going to be doing a little bit of propositional logic here, and it's a very big part of philosophy. It's important. I'll go slowly. I'll try to make it so that it's as painless as possible since we're talking about pleasure right now. So there's two types of conditions. There's sufficient and necessary conditions. Or you could have both. A sufficient and a necessary condition. So we need to know what these are and what it would mean to have both of them at the same time. Okay, so a condition is a requirement for something else. That should intuitively make sense to you. If this is a condition, let's say for employment, it means that I have to satisfy that and then I can have the job. So it's a requirement. Okay. Based on the nature of this conditional relationship, we can make different conditional statements. So we have a conditional relationship between two things, and then based on what kind of conditional relationship that is, we can make certain what we call conditional statements. So let's talk about what those two things are. We have two assertions. Assertion A is you have an abundance of pleasure in your life. That's awesome. I'm happy for you. Assertion B is you have a good life. Maybe that's better, I don't know, maybe that's the same. But I'm also happy for you. Okay, so what kind of condition is A to B? Right? And based on that conditional relationship, what kind of conditional statements can we make? This is actually a big question of hedonism. Right? What relationship exists between having pleasure and having a good life, well-being? Alright, let's see what we can do with this. First, let's talk about what a conditional statement is. It has a very specific form. It's an if-then proposition. So if, and then you have what you call your antecedent. Right, there's a claim there. If that, then your consequent. So it's an if-then. If the antecedent, then the consequent. So based on what kind of condition A is for B will determine whether A is the antecedent in our conditional statement, the consequent, or both. And I've sort of mapped this out here. So we have if they then B. That means A, the relationship is that it's the antecedent. We could have if B then A. There now the B is the antecedent and A becomes the consequent, or we could have both at the same time. So A can be both an antecedent in the first part and in the second part a consequent. That's confusing, right? So we're gonna take step by step here and sort of see what are the see now part of the problem is I want to say what are the consequences, but we're talking about a consequent there. So let's try to use different language. right? What does it mean? How can we unpack this if A, which was you have abundance of pleasure in your life, what's the difference between it being the antecedent or the consequent? Right? That's what we want to know. Okay, so I have up on top here on the slide that A, you have abundance of pleasure in your life, and B, you have a good life. Now, what if A is a sufficient condition of B? What does that mean? That means that if we say A is true, then that is enough for us to be able to say B is true. So we can now make the conditional statement or proposition, if A, then B. And if we substitute A and B as we have listed up here, if you have an abundance of pleasure in your life, then you have a good life. All right, so having pleasure is a condition, it's enough of a condition to satisfy that we can also say then you have a good life. It does not mean though, and this is important, this is what students often get confused on, is this does not mean if you have a good life that you have pleasure, that you have all this abundance of pleasure in your life. It does not mean that. You can't go backwards. So it's only if A holds, if you have pleasure in your life, that you have a good life. But you may have a good life, but not have pleasure. Right? That's sufficient condition. That's the relationship of sufficient condition. Oops, did I go forward? Yes, I did. Okay. So if we have a pleasure of life, then we have a good life. What we have to recognize when A is a sufficient condition of B, and it says he, it should be we. There we go, that's much nicer. Is that there may be other conditions that make B true. So when you have a sufficient condition, it's one way to get there. One way to get to a good life, to have well-being, is through pleasure. But it's not claiming that it's the only way. And there may be other ways, like accomplishments, like doing a lot in your life. Even though you don't have pleasure, you did a lot, you can say, I have a good life. And that I have well-being. Okay, positive well-being. So, let's see. So that's kind of the gist of a sufficient condition, right? It's enough, it's sufficient to get us B, in this case, a good life, well-being, positive well-being, but it's not saying that it's the only way. All right. Back to hedonism. It turns out if the relationship between pleasure and well-being is just a sufficient condition, we don't have hedonism. Because hedonism argues that pleasure is the only way to have a good life. And as a sufficient condition, it's only one way. There can be others. So that's not hedonism, it's something different. Let's talk about a necessary condition. Same statements, same A and B. So what if the relationship, the conditional relationship, is a necessary condition, where A, having pleasure in your life, is a necessary condition for a good life, for positive well-being. So what does this mean? We have to unpack that. What kind of statement can we say then? Well, it means that whenever A is true, A has to be true whenever B is true. So let's put that into the if-then, right? It's whenever B is true. So B has to be true, and then A is true, right? So B is true. If B is true, then it must be the case that A is true. That's why this is called a necessary condition. It has to be that way. So how do we write that? We'd have to say that if B, then A. So when it's a necessary condition, we've switched things around. Now A is the consequent and B is the antecedent. So if you have a good life, then you have an abundance of pleasure in your life. Again, we have to step back and say that we don't want to read too much into that. Because remember, these conditional statements only go one direction. So if B is true, then A is true. But if A is true, that we have all this pleasure in our life, that doesn't mean that B is true. So we know that it has to be true. If we have a good life, we have pleasure. But just because we have a lot of pleasure doesn't mean when this is necessary condition that you have a good life. Alright, so if we have a good life, and we're talking about the relation between pleasure and positive well-being being a necessary condition, then that good life has to be pleasurable. But we have to recognize when A is a necessary condition of B is that though a good life will always be pleasurable life, it still might be the case that a pleasurable life is not a good life. Right? We can't go backwards. What does that mean for hedonism? Well, again, we don't have it. If pleasure is a necessary condition for well-being, for positive well-being, we don't have hedonism. Because hedonism, again, argues that pleasure is the only way to have a good life. As a necessary condition, a good life will always be a pleasurable life. But one could have a very pleasurable life and still not have a good life. So there's more to it than just pleasure. That's why it's not hedonism. Okay, so you could have someone who's extremely wealthy, lives a life of pleasure, but you might say they don't have a good life because everything else is bankrupt. There's nothing there. Okay, that is if the relationship is as a necessary condition. Let's look at that third option where the relationship between pleasure and positive well-being is that pleasure is both a sufficient and necessary condition for positive well-being. Okay, so in this case we're saying if A then B and if B then A. That's kind of a lot. Another way to write this is A if and only if B. So when you see anything in that kind of form, it means it's a sufficient and necessary condition. All right, let's unpack that. So, if we have a pleasurable life, then we have a good life. And if we have a good life, then we have a pleasurable life. We've created something like a relationship of equality, right? If A is true, then B is true. If B is true, then A is true. They're linked together in the strongest way. We know that if one is true, the other is always true. This is hedonism. So hedonism argues that pleasure is the only way to have a good life. And that's what we're saying here basically, is that the only way to a good life is through pleasure, and the only way that we have a good life is through pleasure. Okay, so we can define hedonism in a new way now. We can say that it's a position that holds pleasure as a sufficient and necessary condition for positive well-being, or just well-being. Okay, that's new. What is Hurka's position on all this? Well, if you go back and look at what he says in the conversation, He's basically saying that he is not a hedonist, and he's taking the position that pleasure is a necessary condition for well-being. That anyone who has a good life is going to have pleasure in their life, but it's not the only thing that matters to a good life. So he's going to allow that there's other ways. He talks about accomplishments. He talks about learning. Doesn't get too deep into it, but he's saying there's other ways to have a good life besides pleasure. But pleasure will always be there if you have an actual good life. Okay. Let's see. All right, a little bit more from Hurka on pleasure. He makes some distinctions about pleasure because it's good to kind of get to know what pleasure is and how we can classify it. So he has two ways of classifying. One is that there's simple feelings of pleasure, and the other is that there's pleasure arising from an awareness that something is pleasurable. He calls it the pleasure that blah blah blah. And so one is like just straight out feeling, and the other one is that you kind of have a realization. It's an awareness of something that makes you happy, and you're aware that that's what is making you happy. Okay, the other way that he classifies distinguished pleasure, he says there's specific, localized, or discrete pleasure, and he's contrasting that with general or extended, and he changed the word pleasure to moods. So pleasure becomes something that's kind of distinct. It's pleasure of a specific thing. But if it's just a general feeling, it becomes a mood. And he talks about happiness versus pleasure. And he says you can take these different ways of classifying and can think about all the different combinations. So if we talk about the simple feeling of pleasure, an immediate feeling of pleasure, and it's specific, it might be you're eating chocolate and you're just feeling that pleasure, that chocolatey pleasure of the texture and the sweetness and the sweet bitterness of chocolate, and that's what you're experiencing. If you were to talk about an immediate feeling of pleasure and go over to the other column, more general pleasure or mood, you might be feeling happy because you're just having a good day. And nothing specific, but you're now feeling that good mood. Okay, let's go down to mediated feeling of pleasure. Right, this is the one where it's through an awareness, a thought of something. So specific, you might be feeling pleasure when you realize you won $50. So it's the idea of winning, and you're feeling a pleasure from that. The last column, general pleasure and mediated, so it's through an idea of something. You might feel happy because you have a good life, positive well-being. Okay, and that's sort of the bottom row. Hurka argues is not available to most animals. Sort of humans can be happy due to the idea of something. Alright, sorry about that. Okay. So it's pretty interesting to just think about pleasure, different types of pleasure, way we can classify it. Something that Hurka talks about that's brought up in Mill, when we read Mill. He argues that poetry is better than pushpin. Pushpin is an old game that people used to play. They'd push pins across a tabletop. and you try to get your pin to go over somebody else's pin. If you did that, you won their pin. And back then, pins were actually had some value. It wasn't just like a piece of trash on the ground. It was nice to win some pins. Okay, so people got a lot of pleasure from playing pushpin. Some people love to play it. And Mill argues that poetry is better than pushpin, and he argues it's better because it's a higher quality pleasure. Hurka doesn't take that stance. All right, so he's not going to say that he's not going to take on the principle of hedonistic quality. Instead, he's going to say there's just pleasure is pleasure, but there's more going on in poetry than there is in pushpin. And in poetry, you're exercising, he says, your intellectual capacities, your understanding, your sympathetic feeling. And so there's other values besides pleasure that are positive, that are part of that experience, that adds to it. Because remember, he's not a hedonist, so he's not just considering pleasure, so he can add in other things. Well, we can challenge him on that. I mean, in pushpin, it might just be more than gambling, the pleasure of gambling. There could be a lot of camaraderie. People could be talking. It could be social. Much more could be happening there. So we could really push Hurka on this of whether pushpin, this game, is really better than poetry and why it is. This, I think, is still an open question, and I'd be curious to know what people think. Another thing that Hurka talks about that's pretty interesting is sadistic pleasure. And we know that that's an objection to hedonism. You know, that some people get pleasure from harming others, from torturing others. So how could hedonism and pleasure be a good when it's attached to something like that, the torture? Well, Hurka argues, well, the pleasure is still a good, but there's other things going on there that have negative value. He uses the term that it's vicious, that harming others is vicious, and that you need to balance it out. You need to look at these other elements alongside the pleasure, and then put values to them all, and figure out whether it ends up being ultimately good or bad. He says with torture, it is so vicious that whatever pleasure is coming out of it, it's not going to be enough. But what if someone gets incredible amounts of pleasure? He says pleasures are good, and who knows, it could be just like almost infinite pleasure someone gets from torturing. Perhaps that would tip the scales. So I'm not sure that this objection completely works, but we do need to think about it. Okay. Let's go to Michael Ty on pain. And I'm not going to spend as much time on this. It was shorter, and I just want to look at a couple of important points that come out. The first is the distinction between subjective and objective. And what is pain? Is pain subjective? What does it mean for somebody to be subjective? It's inside the subject, inside our heads. Right? So pain is just not something out in the real world. It's something in this interior world. It's a construction in our mind. And one of the things that we can look at is this phenomena called phantom limb pain. And what is that? Well, some people can have a limb, lose it, no longer exists anymore, and they can still feel things happen to it. They can feel pain in a toe that they no longer have. And this seems to suggest that pain is subjective. It's just in our heads. On the other hand, you could talk about pain being objective, that it's a physical state of the body. It's an indication of something bad. And it's not all in our heads. So we have this contrast. Is it subjective? Is it objective? In a lot of ways, Ty seems to be arguing that pain is both subjective and objective, right? He talks about brain damage and how that can change the nature of pain. When there's damage to the anterior cingulate cortex, one can feel pain, but it doesn't bother them. He also, though, talks about how pain exists as long as you experience it. So he kind of gives us both, that it is subjective and objective, which is a conflict. All right. As we read through the talk, what we get is a different way of looking at pain. Instead of subjective versus objective and what the nature is, instead he looks at it through pragmatism, a pragmatic understanding of pain. Pragmatism understands things through their use, how they're used, instead of trying to figure out what they are. So the function of pain is to represent or inform us of certain kinds of disturbances. And Ty calls this the instrument model of pain. So that's another way of looking at it. Forget about whether it's subjective or objective. It's kind of a mixture, but let's just think about what we can use it for. All right, some interesting problems that come up with pain. One is, can pain be a good thing? Right? We just assume pain is bad, but what about like mourning the loss of a good friend? Is that really a bad thing? Should we not do that? Should we feel guilty if we feel pain at the loss of a good friend? Intuitively, it seems like we want to say no, but why? And what are the consequences of that? Next is emotional pain. And here we sort of distinguish between physical pain and emotional pain. And when we talk about emotional pain, are we just being metaphorical? Or is that real pain too? Because if it is, it doesn't localize itself to a specific part of the body. And so maybe we have to talk about pain differently. Okay. Actually, I just want to bring up one other interesting issue, and that's the Purple Heart. Right? It's a medal awarded for combat veterans who have been injured in the line of duty. And basically, it's if you shed blood. So it's a physical injury. And some have argued that there are other types of injuries, emotional injuries, PTSD. And when we recognize the sacrifice that soldiers make, should we also recognize that kind of pain, that kind of suffering, that kind of injury? Currently, right now, Purple Heart only is if you've shed blood on the battlefield. Okay. Two more problems. First, we have masochism. Can someone get pleasure from pain? Right? That seems completely a contradiction. But some people do get pleasure from pain, because we know there are masochists. So Michael Ty suggests that maybe it depends, and he says he's talked to people, the context of the pain can have an effect on whether or not we find it at some level pleasurable or just displeasurable suffering. And the last problem is, can we ever be mistaken that we are feeling pain? Because when Ty says before that if you are feeling pain, you're feeling pain. That's all that matters for pain. This is when he was treating it more subjective that pain is a feeling. So if you have that feeling, you have pain. So could you ever be mistaken then that you're feeling pain? And now he says, well, maybe you could be. Because maybe you have such a strong expectation of an immediate pain from an impending stimulus, but then that stimulus doesn't happen. But you were just sure it was going to happen. And so you cry out in pain, and then you realize, oh, it didn't happen. So for a moment, you may have mistaken that you were feeling pain because you expected it so much. Okay. Let's move to Dan Ariely and the problems of perception. And this is all connected to a YouTube video that I want you to watch. The link is in the syllabus, and I'm going to have it on the final slide too. Okay, so he's talking about self-control because he's concerned with why people make bad decisions. Bad decision, he's kind of a hedonist. Bad decisions lead to suffering and pain in life rather than pleasure. And he says there seems to be a perceptual problem. And this is with vision also. When we look at something really far away, it looks small to us. It may be really huge, but because of perspective, it's small. And it's the same thing with pleasure and pain that's far off in the future. The farther off it is, the smaller it appears to us. And the closer the pain and pleasure is, the bigger it looks. And when we're measuring, we could mismeasure. So we might measure that pain that's up front as a lot, whereas the pleasure way far away, if we took the other option, as something not quite big. And then he says, okay, well then you're going to choose to avoid that pleasure, and you're going to miss out actually on a huge amount of pleasure. I mean, you're going to avoid the pain and miss out on a huge amount of pleasure down the road. So it's a way of explaining why we make bad decisions. And he wants to solve this. He wants to say, well, how can we make better decisions? So he comes up with what I call moral engineering. He calls it reward substitution. I don't like substitution. It's not really substituting. It's sort of addition. But what you can do is, if there's something you need to do that's going to be unpleasurable, painful, you're going to have to suffer through. But if you did it, it could lead to more pleasure later on. He says, why wait for that pleasure? Why don't you just add a reward right after you do that unpleasurable event, so that you can feel some of that pleasure up front, and the closer it is, the bigger it seems. So you reward yourself for doing things that you should do but are boring or painful or just pleasurable. And he wants you to think about how you can apply that to your life. So you're a student. You're taking classes. Sometimes you take classes and the readings are hard to get through. But you know, if I do the work, then I'll be able to do well in this class. And that will lead to doing well in college. And that will help me, give me sort of a foot up when I go off to the professional life and get a job. So it's worth it to do that work. But oh my gosh, it's so boring. It's literally painful to me to read this, especially this philosophy. Well, I could add a reward for myself every time that I do my philosophy work. Something that I just enjoy doing that's going to give me pleasure. Once I finish that work, I am going to spend half an hour playing my favorite video game, or listen to my favorite music, or I'm going to buy something for myself, or treat myself to something, some sort of reward. And that this will help you, Dan Ariely argues, make better decisions. Okay, you got to watch the video. It's pretty interesting. And Ariely, who studies sort of behaviorism. He's looking at economics, how people make decisions. He's basing this off his own real life experience. It's very interesting. He was burned as a child. He had to go into the hospital a lot. He needs to get a blood transfusion. He ended up getting a sickness through that. And he got offered a chance to be a part of a research, I guess, project. Their experimental medicine. For a year and a half, he'd have to take this medicine that was just caused incredible pain and suffering every time he took it. But if he was consistently took it for a year and a half, there was a chance that he could turn around his condition and not have a failing liver or die. He was the only one in the program that actually completed it, that went through and every, I guess, week took the medicine. And he got through it because he rewarded himself. Every time he took medicine, he watched. His favorite thing was watching movies, and he rented movies, and he watched them after he took while he was sick. But he loved movies, so it was a way to reward himself while he was still suffering. Get that reward up front, and so it's from his own life, and he's trying to think about how we can morally engineer our lives so that we may make better decisions. Okay, that's it. We're going to move on and take a look at the syllabus. Make sure that you've done the reading and the blogs for next class.